Welcome along to the episode, Rebecca. How are you?
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here with you. I'm well.
Awesome. Well, we are so excited to have you here, right, Neelie?
Absolutely.
Very cool. Well, Rebecca, I've kind of introduced you there, but can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do at Valoir to start us off?
Sure, Joe. So it's really about understanding the relationship between people and technology with a focus on customer experience and employee experience. From a technology perspective, that means looking at human capital management applications, at customer relationship management applications, and all of the data and analytics tools that are so important to tie those together today. And it's interesting how many overlaps we're seeing between the customer experience and the employee experience space. So I think there's a lot we can learn from both sides.
That sounds super interesting, Rebecca. And that is exactly one of the things that we will be talking about, of course, in today's episode. Now, in a Valoir Insight brief for 2021, it says that this year we will see emerging technologies gain ground to address the long-term realities of a remote workforce. More specifically, there are three elements that are being mentioned. It's the physical, the technological, and process. Zooming in on the technological aspect for a moment, one thing that the brief mentions is the backlash and gaming of productivity monitoring tools. Can you perhaps elaborate on that?
Sure. I think everyone moving with work from home initially had a very tough period where everybody was working very hard to make it work. Our data in May of last year showed that the productivity drop from the move to remote work was only 1% across the board, which is pretty impressive given that people were working on laptops, on couches in a lot of cases. What we've seen as companies look to operationalize remote work moving forward is thoughts about a much more standardized approach to scheduling, but also to employee productivity monitoring. Now, those tools run the gamut, from keystroke monitoring and video monitoring to employee self-reporting tools. We find most companies are feeling most comfortable with somewhere in the middle. An important factor to think about when we think about those tools, though, is what is in it for the employee. If we look at what Microsoft is doing with Microsoft Graph, for example, if I'm willing to share my information, I can get personalized information for me about how I could maybe be more productive with my day. That doesn't necessarily go to my manager. That's a great example of personalizing the data for the employee experience.
Super interesting, Rebecca. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind when we talk about sort of measuring productivity and this productivity data is kind of like, whoa, it's a little bit Big Brother in a sense. Are you seeing any kind of like, what sort of reflections are you seeing in the market? Any backlash around that?
I think we'll continue to see strong pushback against it, Joe. And what's interesting, again, if we go back to the customer experience versus employee experience thought for a minute, I'm comfortable as a customer sharing certain data with a retailer, for example, so that they can give me a better experience. If we translate that to the employee space, yes, I don't want Big Brother looking over my shoulder. But if it can be a tool to deliver a better employee experience for me, then I may be willing to give up some of that control, as long as I know what the data is being used for.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I'm sure we will come back and touch on that in more detail, but it's such an interesting trend, especially given COVID and work from home, as you said. I guess on the other side of that, on a positive note, it really gives employees and businesses the opportunity to kind of identify areas of work or processes that are inefficient. You talk a little bit about that in the brief as well. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So what we've seen with the move to remote work is employees left to their own devices a bit more, which can have very positive outcomes. In fact, in a lot of cases, we've seen the adoption of low-code tools, for example, across the enterprise, where employees say, this is a process that was tedious when I was in the office and ridiculous when I'm out. So let's use some basic tools to automate it. Fantastic boost in productivity and a great way to bring structure and data gathering around a business process. Another key area that we're seeing employees really taking their own path on is skilling and training, going to outside training sources, going to peer-to-peer mentoring, going to volunteering opportunities, for example, that give them new skills, looking at different opportunities beyond what HR provides from a training and reskilling perspective.
Yeah, I think these are super interesting developments that we are seeing. I'd like to touch on something that is always a challenge for companies, and that is employee engagement. Even in normal times, so to speak, companies are always thinking about, okay, how can we engage our employees more? There are so many surveys that have been done on employee engagement, and usually they show quite shocking stats. We all know that. But of course, with the events of last year, so many people either working remotely, and those who can't work remotely, they often find themselves in rather challenging circumstances with all the new measures that they have to take into account and so on. So the brief that we mentioned, Rebecca, also talks about employee engagement, and then more in particular about surveys. And I really like how the surveys are being described as, at best, a limited way to assess how employees are doing, and at worst, they are more of a checklist item than a way to assess wellness and focus. In your experience, what have most organizations been doing with the data that they gathered from employee surveys so far, Rebecca?
Well, let's face it, Neelie, most surveys stink. They're backward looking, a way to either congratulate ourselves or blame someone for something that happened or the sentiment 6 months ago at our company. They're not forward looking. They don't give me as an HR professional anything prescriptive about how to do better, about groups that may be in need, about individuals that need special attention. Surveys do none of that. So whoever decided to call surveys employee experience, don't get me started. I will say, though, what we have seen is an opportunity here. Everyone recognizes that remote work creates distance, that productivity and mental health and wellness are issues for people adjusting with the stresses of a very, very changed work and personal environment for a lot of people. It's an opportunity for HR to take advantage of some of these newer technologies, to stop driving while looking in the rearview mirror and use some of this data to actually be proactive about understanding employees. Now, that means sentiment analysis. That means wrapping natural language processing around the data that I do have and doing a better job of analyzing the data that I have.
And what makes you think that HR will start doing that now? If they haven't really done anything with the data from employee surveys, what makes you think that they might use the data that they get from using these new kinds of technologies?
I think HR has always had too much data to deal with, right? 2/3 of HR organizations were tasked with gathering new data last year. And most of them said, I don't do enough or know what to do with all the data that I have. The difference here is two things. First, better tools. I'm getting data in context in a meaningful way as opposed to endless spreadsheet. Second, the application of the tools to the user space into the employee experience space, where with data visualization tools, I don't have to be a data scientist to understand some basics about sentiment analysis. A lot of the HCM vendors building these capabilities into their tools to give HR rapid insights to data. It's not the old send away a file of surveys to someone for months. It's much more in the moment and much more about being able to identify, if not specific individuals, then certainly groups within the organization, teams within the organization that need HR's attention.
I think that's such a good point, Rebecca, and it's kind of been a theme of a lot of conversations we've been having with other guests on the podcast as well, is that what you were mentioning around surveys, it's time to go beyond this tick the box of, doing things that just prove, kind of fit in with what we already wanted to do anyway, and actually starting to use data to uncover things that are going on in the business. I'm interested to know about maybe some practical steps that an HR department could take to starting, as you said, to uncover this data and use it for a specific purpose. Say an HR department is in that situation that you just described where they have so much data all over the place, but they don't know what to do. Are there any practical steps that you would advise them to take?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. First, take a day and take a data visualization course. In the absence of being able to take a data scientist to lunch, which we don't necessarily want to do right now, getting a sense of what is out there in the world of data visualization and the art of the possible, even if it's not in your HR organization right now, can be a real eye-opener. Second, take a look at the many different try before you buy data visualization tools that are out there. Some within the HCM space and focused on that, others that aren't. But there are plenty of tools that you can experiment with to get your feet wet without making a big commitment or making an investment. And third, I would say you have to start to think differently about the data you have. It's really about looking forward rather than looking backward. And that's an important mind shift for HR to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a super interesting answer, Rebecca, with the 3 elements that you mentioned there. And I think as well, if we talk about skills and specifically skills for HR professionals, I think indeed knowing something about data visualization, for instance, and knowing the basis as well, data and how to look at them, I think that would be a super important skill for HR professionals going forward in any case. I'd like to change. Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I would say about that is you're absolutely right for HR professionals. I think, Neelie, HR is one of those divisions in the organization that often has its own IS department. So there's been this expectation that the data analysis and gathering happens by HRIS folks. In almost every other division in the company, business users today are doing data visualization with business user-friendly tools. So it's time for HR to break down that conceptual barrier between HRIS and HR when it comes to actually analyzing data.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'd like to talk about something else for a moment, Rebecca, and that is talent mobility. Going back to that brief that we mentioned, so talent mobility is also a big topic for many organizations, even more so once again after the events of last year and actually the events that are still going on. So HR will need to adopt new tools, for instance, AI-driven talent marketplaces. That is something that we see pop up as something that is going to happen again and again to help people identify new opportunities. Now, what I was wondering, where do you see contractors, freelancers, and other types of contingent workers in this? Because companies, of course, increasingly work with people that are not necessarily employees in the traditional sense of the words.
Right. We're certainly seeing, with hiring freezes, a lot of contracting going on. We're also seeing a lot more flexibility in location. So as a remote worker, I may be looking at opportunities in a number of different places. I may be looking at multiple opportunities because as a remote worker, a contract laborer, as long as I'm getting my work done, it may not be my only job. The employer may have a contractor that is working multiple opportunities. So for a contractor, it's really an opportunity to try before you buy or commit to a job as well as the employer. So I think what we'll see is employers differentiating in areas like training and areas like making contractors part of the broader work pool, at least conceptually and from an upskilling perspective, so that they can stay engaged and continue contributing.
Is there a piece there, I'm just thinking as well, Rebecca, is there a piece there around actually, as potentially the contingent workforce grows, actually bringing those contingent workers into the fold more and more in terms of your HR processes, HR data, and things like that? Are you seeing that as a trend?
Well, certainly if we think about employee engagement, we have to think about everyone who's employed. contractor or not. And so looking at moving forward, we're throwing surveys out the window, but including those contractors where it's legally feasible in ongoing training in real employee activities, and having interaction with HR is going to be important. It's going to be important to keeping them engaged and productive while on contract, and perhaps in the future as they more fully engage as a full-time employee.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is really interesting stuff, Rebecca. Thank you. Want to kind of go back onto that theme that we were talking about earlier around productivity monitoring.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think this is such a big topic, and one that when you hear about, as we said, it sounds a little bit Big Brother. So I want to dive into it a little bit more. So really just wanted to explore a little bit the ownership of data, especially when it comes to productivity measurement and things like that. The sense that there's been a bit more of an explosion in HR data. You were talking before about how there's seas and oceans of it. What's happening in terms of that ownership of that data?
So I think we saw the same thing with email when that first happened, right? Everything that happens on my work email is owned by the company. So I think moving forward, as we think about capturing video, about capturing text, employees do need to understand that. And I think inherently they're aware of that. The flip side of that is exactly what we talked about with customer experience, right? With those rights to data come responsibilities. So companies need to be transparent about how they're not just analyzing that data, but capturing and storing that data, to whom it may be distributed. So it's time to have that ethical use discussion, both within and outside of HR, about the types of gathering I'm doing on data, the types of employee data I'm gathering, how it's being used, and why. The flip side is we should be gathering that data for a purpose. So if we're gathering it for the sake of gathering it, then you're being a very ineffective big brother, but you're having a detrimental impact on employee experience with now no potential benefit. The benefit of using that data is being able to thoughtfully address issues in the employee population before they become bigger issues. But that means actually analyzing the data. If we look at some of the different productivity tools that are out there, it's very interesting because a lot of them talk about them as management and communications tools, not necessarily productivity monitoring. I know we mentioned Microsoft, for example, where they have the self-assessment tool where I, as an employee, can get suggestions on how I can be more productive with my day, which makes it more palatable to some people, particularly those who are competitive and into gamification and benchmarking, and certainly that group of employees exists. That can be an effective way to deliver and manage that data. Other companies are looking at more as a communication tool. So give the tools to the managers to be able to say, I'd like to have a conversation about how you're using your day, not you're spending 20 minutes on email or whatever the actual data is.
What do you think, Rebecca, about that? So if you say that as companies are starting to gather more data on employee productivity, whether it is monitoring keystrokes, I know that some companies have also started to listening to the employees' voices, because how we are talking and the intonation in our voice can indicate whether or not we are doing well, and that then may lead to some information about how likely we are to stay with the company or not. Anyhow, you know much more about this than I do, I think. But so as companies are gathering more and more data from employees, shouldn't the ownership of that data lie with the employees? And if that would be the case, don't you think then that employees would also be more willing to trust their employer with their data?
I think it's an important balance, Neelie, and you really touched on the relationship between the employer and the employee. We have to have the conversation about who owns that data. I wouldn't expect anything on my PC to belong to me, right, if the company bought it. But where does that line become invasive if I'm working from my home? If I am a parent working early hours and late hours, should I be monitored 9 to 5? Those kind of conversations need to be happening now about different employee groups so that we can actually use the tools and the data to be effective, not just as another way to gather data on employees.
I think that's such a good point, Rebecca, in terms of how it's approached by the HR department. If it's actually there to serve the employees, already that's half the battle won, I guess, in terms of, is it going to make the employee's life better, or is it just serving the business and just serving the HR department?
Well, and the important thing to remember too is it's gathering data, just like any other method of gathering data. If there's poor management, if there are existing problems, gathering data is not going to help. Looking at productivity monitoring as a way to increase the productivity of employees that we don't think are productive is counterproductive. There has to be the human side, the empathetic side to that, to look at not just if Big Brother's watching, you'll walk the line, but how do you engage with the employee to make sure that their productivity is being positively impacted by whatever the company's doing.
Yeah, and I also think, Rebecca, what you said earlier is super important here about being transparent as an organization, as a company, about what you want to use that data for. And once you've used that data, to also show with the people working in the company what the results are and how their results have helped improve certain processes, for instance, so that people know, okay, this is what my data is being used for, and this has been the positive effect for the company, and by extension, perhaps also for me in the company.
Yeah, really transparency is key. And if we think back to the customer experience, right, it's about communication. It's about enabling people to opt in some cases, but also to show them what the value is to them in being a part of that data set.
I see we're sort of starting to wrap this up in a little way. We've got a couple last questions for you, Rebecca, and this has been such an interesting conversation all around data, HR, and the world of work. If we take it broader and we talk about all the kinds of data that HR departments can gather and that relates to working, what is one area that you think HR should start using data differently or better in 2021? If there's one first, low-hanging fruit or first opportunity.
Absolutely. It's training. It's around learning. So much of what we track in LMSs is broken. We should be looking at what employees are learning in extra company sources, in volunteering opportunities, in mentoring opportunities, in peer-to-peer opportunities, and all of those sources of training, it's reskilling and advancement that come outside the LMS bubble. LMSs are broken. So we need to think about, as HR professionals, how do we look at all of those different sources of reskilling, training, enrichment for employees to understand not just their current talent profile, but what their career trajectory is and how those different sources can be tracked to help them get there.
I really, really like that, Rebecca, because that really comes down to having a holistic approach to learning and not just taking into account what people may or may not be doing in the company LMS, but indeed all the learning moments that someone has, whether it is indeed from learning from their peers or mentoring or coaching or things that they may be learning in their personal life, but skills that they can use as well when they are in the company. I really like that.
Thanks, Neelie. I think we forget that a lot of learning happens in areas like volunteer opportunities, employee resource groups, peer-to-peer learning. And we can't just slap a new sticker on a learning management system and call it a learning experience platform. We really have to think about how we take, as you said, a more holistic approach and understanding all of the different types of training that contribute to an employee's talent profile and bringing those all together.
I'm just wondering here, Rebecca, do you have an idea how we can go about that? Have you perhaps seen companies start to do this? Having this more holistic approach to learning and having an overview of what their employees are learning like wherever they are?
I think there are certainly companies that are coming closer to doing that. We've looked at some companies that are using philanthropy, for example, their employee volunteering programs as a way to think about enriching talent. So, for example, sending managers at a certain level into, in North America, communities of color to learn about diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, as part of their volunteering and training experiences. So it's that sort of thing when you're thinking beyond what may be HR's traditional role in training, about including those kind of opportunities. Again, takes a much broader lens than we normally think about with an LMS.
And even from its most foundational sense, if you think about the way people learn, it's not sitting in a room or watching a screen and trying to learn. Is often you learn by the experiences you have. So I love that example that you just gave of actually going out and visiting people and being amongst people. That's a really cool way of looking at it. So a final question, Rebecca, that we wanted to ask you, and that we always ask at the end of interviews on the podcast, is around a challenge. So we'd love if you could leave our listeners with a challenge based on the things we've been talking about today around data. Do you have a challenge for our listeners?
So I would say two challenges. First, take on data visualization. Taking a course to learn about it, even if you never use it, will open your eyes and make you think about data in a different way. Second, as we think about working from home and remote work, now is the time to think about the links between mental health and mental well-being and productivity. Our data shows that the hardest hit, both in terms of mental impact and productivity of those during their move to remote work, are employees working alone at home without a partner, spouse, or child. So it's important to remember that while other groups may need accommodation because of these specific times, it's time to think as well about the link between mental health and productivity and those employees that may have been toiling alone in somewhat isolation for a number of months.
Two challenges, Rebecca. I think that's awesome. The first challenge, data visualization, really get into it. I may actually check out a course myself, Joe, I think, about data visualization. And the second one is, and I think this is super important and not to be underestimated, is indeed be really mindful about people's mental health, especially those who are working remotely and are alone without indeed a spouse or a family at home. I think this is indeed, something that we should all be super mindful of. And I think try to make a connection even more, an actual connection with these people. So thank you so much. Two challenges, Rebecca. I love it. And thank you once again for joining us in this episode.
Joe, Neelie, thank you. It was my pleasure. Anytime.